My story was that I was born dead. Mother was expecting twins. Father was really, really sick. And when she went into labor, they were afraid that to have the babies where he was, they're sick. And so my grandfather bundled her up and took her to Annis. They were living in Manan. Took me over to Annis to my aunt's home. And we got there, I should say she got there, and was there only a short time when she gave birth to my twin brother. But I didn't want to come. Grandfather ran into Rigby to get the doctor. And the doctor came and they finally got me born. I was breech birth. And the doctor, I don't know how much time he spent with me, but he finally laid me down and said, "This one's dead." My aunt, whose home we were at, my mother's sister, started cleaning me up, and I was all limp and everything. And then for some reason, unbeknownst to anybody, she just decided to blow in my mouth. And she blew in my mouth and inflated my lungs. And I began to cry. And then I cried all the time, she said. Couldn't shut me up. I just cried and cried and cried. Very fussy baby. And after I got out of high school, I went to work for a radio station where I wrote commercials, which I had absolutely no training for. But I wrote commercials, and then I started doing a little bit of airtime. And I got my FCC license so that I could actually run the control board. And so I ran the control board a little bit, and that was a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed that. And this was over in the Twin Falls area after we were married. And then we moved back to Idaho Falls, and I began to work at another radio station. And at this station I did more airtime and really enjoyed it, and was able to, all this time I'm working really hard. I have to really concentrate on everything that I'm doing. And I worked really, really hard. And I was working at this radio station when Channel 10 became available. And the radio station I was working at, licensed Channel 10. And they needed programming to fill in on Channel 10. And we did things like bingo and all these fun things. And then they decided to run a children's program. And so I became a story lady on Channel 10 TV. And that was one job that I just thoroughly enjoyed. I was at my best working with the children, and it was so fun. While I was working for this radio station, one of my jobs was to listen all the time so that I could tell if they went off the air. And so when the teletype started going crazy, I went in and ripped the news story off and ran in and told them that John F. Kennedy had been shot, and was the first to announce that news on the air. As I went through my life, I had many pleasurable things. I met Howard W. Hunter once. He was a member of the Quorum of the 12 at that time, and I got to shake hands with the prophet David O. McKay when he came to Idaho Falls. L. Tom Perry was a relative, and so he came to, we had a big Perry family reunion, and he came, and we got to spend some private visit time with him, just like you were visited with your other family members. And so that was a high point in my life. And so I've had a lot of interesting experiences in my life, in spite of the fact that these things were hard for me. A few years back, I was talking to my family doctor about some weird problem that had happened, and he looked at me and he said, well, that's very normal for a person with autism. And that was at that time that I learned that I was autistic. And I think that I've had an amazing life considering everything.
Okay, so my story today is about my grandmother, Margaret Blackhorse Sakisi. She grew up on the reservation, really rural area, about the 1919, I think, was around the time she was born. It's really early on, really rural area. And so our family in that area for a very long time has been, kind of the more agricultural, a combination of a little bit of farming, but it's not a super great growing area. So a lot of sheep herding and stuff like that for trading and to use the wool for blankets, just, all sorts of stuff. So we've always been really big into sheep herding, and there's a big, almost like ranch area with, all the different spots for them and such. So she was really big into going out and doing the herding herself while her husband was off doing usually construction work. So there were a lot of construction hats around the house. And since it could get really sunny out there, she would occasionally throw one on before she went out herding so that she had something to keep the sun out of her eyes. And so she just did that at random, before she went out one day. And it just so happened that there's a freak lightning storm where she was that actually was so bad that she was struck by lightning. And when she came to, she looked around and saw all her sheep around her smoldering. But because she had been wearing the construction hat, she was totally fine other than down a few sheep, and she just went along her day.
My story is of a four-great-grandmother. She was born in Connecticut. She was born in 1811. Her name was Henry Blakesley Fitch, and married Isaac Morley. So she had several names. She was married at 20. She had 3 sons, and then 2 of the little boys died very young. And her husband passed away 5 days after the second little boy died. So she was left with just the older boy, and it was a very, very difficult time for her. Yeah, it was sometime after, and I don't know the exact date, but she joined the church and traveled to Nauvoo, where she married Isaac Morley. And he was a patriarch in the church at that time and was very influential in that community. They were sealed in the Nauvoo Temple in 1844. And they made preparations right away to go to Salt Lake. They left winter quarters with Brigham Young's wagon train, would have been 1848. And she kept a journal as they traveled along. It's a little bit of an interesting story. I might just mention a little bit on her journal. She talks quite often of the type of terrain that they travel. They would travel about 15 miles a day. This is just a little clip of what she said. June 4th, this is 1848. Pleasant morning. Went to meetings in the forenoon. Washed in the afternoon. Good soft water and plenty of it. Singing in the evening. June 5th, 7 o'clock, took our departures from the Horn. Quiet, cold, uncomfortable riding. About 9 o'clock, Sister Grove brailed from her wagon, and one wheel passed over her leg, which broke the bone. The company was detained but a short time. We arrived at the Platte about 3 in the afternoon. Very pleasant place to camp, singing and prayers at Brother Morley's wagon. She would often refer to him as Father Morley or Brother Morley, and it would be her husband. Well, they arrived in Salt Lake. She had a child born that year. It would have been early in 49. Brigham Young asked Isaac Morley and his family to settle Manti. Chief Walker was of the Ute Nation, and by some reports he asked Brigham Young to send some of his settlers to Manti, which would have been the very first settlement south of Provo, and asked them to go with a group of people down and settle that area. And the chief apparently wanted them to help some of his Indians to learn how to grow grain. But there's other reports that indicated that it wasn't a very equitable situation. The Indians were not friendly. They were very hostile at that first few years they were there. So Isaac Morley took his young family and 224 people. They went down to San Pete area, which is now Manti, and built a fort and began to settle. That first winter was very harsh. About half of their cattle died. They didn't have enough food. It was very, very brisk. And the Indians were giving them a lot of concern and a lot of trouble. At one point, the Indians of about 200 number came to the fort, and Isaac Morley and Hannah were in their wagon. And they had the baby with them. He was almost a year old. His name was Simeon. And they were just coming from outside the fort toward them. And they stopped, the Indians stopped with them and demanded that they have wheat and horses and cattle, and were very belligerent about it. And Isaac told them that they didn't have it. They were short of supply, but they would have more the next day, and that they would share with them on that next day. Well, the Indians didn't want to take that as an answer, and they said that they were going to burn the settlement. And then they said, if you'll give us your baby, we won't burn the settlement. Well, Hannah, of course, grabbed onto her baby and absolutely refused. And after much dickering back and forth, Isaac finally told her, says, if you don't give them the baby, they are going to kill everyone and burn the fort. So she gave them her baby. And of course, the heartbreak, they rode away with this baby. And they said they'd be back the next day for grain. Well, that night was a very horrible night for them, and many in the community joined with them in prayer that night. Well, the next day, about 10 o'clock, the Indians came back, but they brought the baby back, and which was very uncustomary. Usually, if they took a baby, they kept them. But they gave the baby back, and the Indians said, your squaw was very sad. We brought the baby back. But they had stained the baby brown. They had put tea on him and made him look like a baby, an Indian baby. They had dressed him in white, soft leathers. He had beaded shoes, was dressed like a beautiful little Indian baby, but they did bring him back. And of course, it was quite a glorious time for them. There's a statue that is made in the Manti area, and it was inspired by her story. This is a picture of the statue that is there, and it's just significant of the women of that era that were so brave, and they had so many trials and so many difficult situations, but handled it with such faith and such strength that it was really an inspiring story. She also devised or designed a quilt block. And this was her quilt block, and I just reproduced it on a piece of fabric, but she had that entered into a contest they had in Relief Society. But I think these women had such faith and such strength in very, very difficult circumstances that we can hold faith from what they did. And I am very, very grateful that she is my grandmother.
Today I'd like to share my story with you about actually my grandma, Lucy Matina Allred Brown. And she was born in 1916. She was the oldest child in her family. And when she was 17 years old, she married. And shortly after her marriage, her father got cancer and died. She lost her second baby boy. He was just 3 hours old and he passed away. And after that, my father was born. He was very small, and so it made her very nervous. And also as a child, my grandma had rheumatic fever, which caused her lots of health problems throughout the rest of her life. And she wasn't able to finish maybe past the 6th grade because of all of her illness. So her younger years were full of lots of trials. And after my dad was born, her mother died. And so as a young 20-year-old mother, both of her parents had passed away. My grandma was a hard worker. She had a perfect house. Whenever we'd go over, everything was always in its place, and she took pride in that. My dad always talked about how if things were out of place, his dirty clothes would be on the front lawn, after she'd asked him to pick it up. So she was very over the top. But also she would help my grandpa. He worked for the railroad, and if he didn't get home in time, lots of nights she'd be out milking the cows. And I can still have a faded memory of watching her walk back towards the house when we'd pull in to do a visit or something, and she'd have the get up on, the farm boots and the overalls. Around the age of 60, she had to have open heart surgery. It was the first one that she had. And that just kind of started the spiral of her health problems. She had other dealings. She had cancer. She had another heart surgery, and just many other different health problems that she went through. So I would just like to talk a little bit about my favorite memories about my grandma. When we were little girls, me and my older sister, we were close in age, and we would get to stay at my grandma's overnight, and she would be so excited that we got to come over to her house, and she would always have something special for us. She'd say, okay, let's go in my room and see what surprise I have. And so we'd get down on the floor and look what was under the bed, and she would hide things that we would get to discover. And it would be maybe a new coloring book with the latest, newest crayons. And when I was young, I still remember there were fluorescent Crayola crayons. Maybe some of you wouldn't remember that, but people about my age would. And just paper dolls or something to paint, just anything kind of art. One of our other favorite memories of my grandma was the sleep part. We'd get into her bed with her, and she'd have at least 8 quilts piled on the bed. And so once you got your spot, the pillow and where you felt your neck was just right, you knew you weren't going to roll over. I mean, we just lay there flat in the bed. And me and my older sister, we still laugh about our sleepovers and the fact that you couldn't move but from the weight of the quilts. And Christmas was always magical. Christmas Day was spent at my Grandma Brown's house. And we would go and just be excited to show her what, fun things maybe we got for Christmas. The Christmas dinner, she made she only had 2 children, my dad and his older sister, and so there weren't very many of us, but the whole dining table was packed with food, plus food on the stovetop and the counters. And so you can imagine it was just, Christmas dinner heaven, and you could just pick whatever you want. And I still remember, putting all the olives on every finger and eating them, and probably did it a couple of times. And the only one that it really bothered would be my mother, thinking, it's a little bit over the top. But I just remember having to pull out TV trays and sit around the front room because we couldn't sit to the dining table because it was so full of food. The things, though, that mean the most to me about my grandma is just always feeling so loved by her. She always, went out of her way to do great things for us, to call us on the phone. She was always wanting to know what we're up to. And just the things that she would do with us. It was the time. She spent time helping us learn how to paint things or make crafty things. She would let us make a mess, and then, of course, we'd help clean up. When I returned from my mission, I had been caught in a coup, and so I was stuck in the Philippines for about 6 days. And so when I actually made it home, my grandma at that time had started in the early phases of Alzheimer's, and she was just very upset that that something bad had happened to me, and she just followed me around my parents' home, just over and over, saying, "I'm so glad you're home. I'm so glad you were safe. I'm so so happy." And I just never had to doubt that I was a special granddaughter to my grandma. It's just something that's dear to my heart, of just knowing that someone loves you so much, and I could always feel it from her when I was with my grandma. So during this past year, I've had a really strong desire and drive to write my grandma's family history, or her story. I called my first cousin DJ and said, "Hey, where's grandma's life sketch that you gave at the funeral?" And he said, "I'll look." He texted back and said, "I can't find it anywhere." And so I was distraught. And I asked my aunt, well, what about the video from her funeral? Does anyone have the video? She said, I don't think there was one. And I searched all over my mom's house and couldn't find one at my mom's house. And so the thoughts have been over and over, please don't forget me. Do not forget me. So recently, at the Roots Tech conference, they introduced a movie. I hadn't seen the movie Coco, and they played one of the songs at one of the events. And as I sat there and listened to the song, it just went straight to my heart, because these are the words that have been in my mind of remember me. So I'd just like to share with you the words to the lyrics of part of that song. And it goes like this. Remember me, though I have to say goodbye. Remember me. Don't let it make you cry. Forever if I'm far away, I hold you in my heart. I sing a secret song to you each night we are apart. Remember me, though I have to travel far. Remember me each time you hear a sad guitar. Know that I am with you, the only way that I can be, until you're in my arms again. Remember me. And that's just what I want to do. I want to remember my grandma, because she loved me so much.
Alrighty, I guess I'm going to give a more detailed story of when I met my husband. So in 2000, year 2000, that's when it was. I was on my mission, got sent to Portland, Oregon, and I was in Gresham, Oregon at my first area in the Kelly Creek Ward. And my mission, the ward mission leader was Brett Howard. He was very, very cool. He was probably one of my favorite ward mission leaders. I really enjoyed him. And his family, he had a young family. And he had a nephew staying with him who was working with him in his carpet business and earning money so that he could go on his mission, and his name was James Howard. So we went over to their house all the time for dinner and meetings and stuff like that. And I heard about James, and I saw him, and I met him. And I thought, well, good for him for working and getting ready to go on his mission. So left that area, didn't really think too much about him again until I was serving in a singles ward in Vancouver, and I ran into a guy that had been friends with James, and he told me that he had gone on this mission. So I thought, awesome, good for him. That's so great that he went on his mission. Got home from my mission, went to BYU, Idaho, was there for a couple of years. Wasn't dating very much, unfortunately. Really wanted to get married. Wasn't dating. Decided to get on LDS Singles, the website, internet stuff. So chatted with a bunch of different guys, went out on some dates. Wasn't really finding anything interesting. Decided that wasn't for me, so I got off the site, didn't want to deal with it. It was my last year of college, and I went to my ward expecting, oh yay, new people, it's going to be so fun, and there was just nobody that was even interesting possibly to date. So I thought, you know what, this isn't very much fun. My roommates were cool, but we weren't really very close yet, so I thought I'm just going to jump on the website again, the LDS Singles website, and just try to meet local boys, because they totally knew how to have fun. They knew fun places to go, and I'd always really enjoyed that in the past. So got on. Usually what I did when I started on the LDS Singles site was I would go through and I would see who seemed interesting, and there was this little button where you could poke them. So bizarre. So I went through and I poked all these little people, and if anyone contacted me back, then I'd have a conversation with them or something. So I had done that. I had seen James's picture on there, and I didn't know it was him at the time, but he was cute and he had good information about him. So I poked him, and he started chatting with me online. We were just typing back and forth, and so I thought, oh, this is cool. And then he was just so boring. And I thought, I'm just gonna stop talking to him because this just isn't working out. And then he mentioned Mount Hood Community College, because he had been taking a few classes there. And I thought, wait, that's where I served my mission, is right where Mount Hood Community College was. So we started chatting a little bit more, and he got much more interesting after this. Realized that I had been the sister missionary that had visited at his uncle's home, and he had been the boy that was getting ready to go on his mission. And so against all my internet safety protocol that I usually followed, I decided I could probably go out with him pretty soon, and it didn't have to be quite so intense. I had really strict rules for meeting people online. So we set up a date about a week after that, and we went out, and it was so much fun. We drove up into the mountains, and we just talked the entire way. And then we went out a couple more times, and then we were pretty much dating exclusively after that. And I was thinking seriously, and he was thinking seriously, and we ended up getting engaged 6 weeks after that. I actually went and spent Thanksgiving with his family, because he lived in Parker, Idaho, and I was in Rexburg, so it was really close. And so I spent Thanksgiving with his family, and I remember his parents taking him upstairs, and I was downstairs, and I was like, okay, here it is. They're gonna tell him that he needs to take me home and not date me anymore, because that's just how I thought. Really bad attitude about things. And he came back down, and he said, Mom and Dad want us to go up to the cabin with them and just spend a couple of nights up there with them, so we can just kind of all get to know each other better. So I was in total shock, but thinking, hey, that could be really, really fun. So the four of us went to a cabin that their family owns, and we just had a really, really, really neat time. It was really cool because they had a loft upstairs, and so his parents were downstairs, and we just went upstairs and sat on the couch kind of looking out over the loft. Basically, he asked me what I wanted for Christmas, and I said, I'd like something sparkly. and he's like, oh, really? Well, do you want a bracelet? And he played really dumb and stuff, and then finally he was like, yeah, I think that's probably a good idea. And so basically I asked him. We got engaged, and then 6 weeks after that we were married, and his mom was pushing us to get married in 4 weeks, but I really needed a couple more weeks to get a wedding put together. So, and we have been married for 13 years and have 5 kids, and it's a good life.
Well, the person I chose was my grandfather, who is Frank Roberts, and he was born in Provo, Utah. And then he moved down to Los Angeles, California, where he became a costumer for MGM Studios. And his most person that he did costumes for was Clark Gable. He did work on The Wizard of Oz. He worked on Tarzan and His Mate, which was not Clark Gable. He worked on Mutiny and the Bounty. I'm sure you've seen that movie. He worked on Romeo and Juliet with Leslie Howard and Norma Shearer. He worked on Test Pilot with Clark Gable. And he worked on The Yearling. And as a matter of fact, Claude Jarman Jr., the little boy in The Yearling, was my mom's best friend. She played with him a lot. Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn, he worked with them. He worked closely with Stuart Granger as well. He played tennis with Stuart Granger, and my mom had a big crush on Stuart Granger. And he was married to Ava Gardner at that time, and they would go over, and my mom would just look at all her gowns, and it was just fantastic. I as a little girl, used to go into my grandmother's closet and look at all her fancy clothes, because it was kind of cool. He worked with Robert Taylor, and there are many, there are a few pictures that he worked on where he received an Adam and Eve Award, which is a high honor for a costumer, kind of like a Golden Globe or whatever you call it, for a costumer. Even though on the pictures it did not say his name, he worked under a man who was his boss, and his name was in there. My grandfather worked on The Big Circus. I only knew him for 2.5 months of my life, because he died the same day I was blessed. So, anyway, he was just an awesome man to know, and I'm so glad that even though he worked in Hollywood, he still had a strong testimony and was strong in the church. He worked on National Velvet. He worked on King Solomon Mines, Kiss Me Kate, Across the Wye, Missouri, and many others. There were many actors and actresses that came to his funeral when it was time, and he was just a great man, and I truly appreciate him. That's it.
I thought I would tell a story of my grandmother. When she was in Germany in about 1939, she met and married her husband. They were married for just a couple of months, and then there was a war between Germany and Russia and Poland. And Poland lost, and so between Germany and Russia, they divided it up, and the German people that were living in Russia were moved closer to Germany and Poland. And so my grandmother and her husband and then my grandmother's family were moving over there. When they moved, they could only take so many people at a time because they didn't have enough wagons. So my grandma was separated, and she ended up taking a train which got sent to another place. And she actually was in this strange city. They made them do a lice wash or whatever, so they sent them into this big room with all these showers, and however they did that, and they took their clothes in a different place and cleaned them, and I think that was quite traumatizing to her. And then she was there all by herself for quite a while, for quite a few days, until her husband and her dad finally found her. And so she was reunited with them, and she said she wouldn't leave her husband's side again because that was so traumatizing to her. But then they were kind of put into a refugee camp until they could figure out where to put them. And while she was in the refugee camp, she became very ill. And so they sent him to the hospital, which hospitals in those days were a bad thing, and you only went to the hospital if you were going to die. And so here she got put in the hospital, and she said at night they would put them out on the balcony, and that way if anybody died, they were kind of cooler, so they didn't smell as bad or whatever. And she made it through the night, and then they found out that actually she was just pregnant and really sick. So they quickly moved her in and started feeding her and stuff so she wouldn't die. But that was quite traumatic, and she quickly got out of the hospital, went back to the refugee camp, and eventually she and her husband were given a farm, and they were told that the Polish people that the farm belonged to were moved to another farm more inland. But they didn't really know how that all worked out. But they were given a farm, and she said when they got to the farm, there was still stuff on the stove cooking, a fire in the fireplace, and chickens in the yard. So the people were obviously moved out quite quickly. They were taxed and had to give so much meat and grain to the government to support the troops or whatever. I don't know how that worked. But she said that it was really hard, and they had to have a hired man to help them. And the hired man actually made more money than they did. By that time, they had one baby. Eventually, she became pregnant with my dad. So they were there just a couple of years, and then my grandpa, Herman, got drafted into the army, and they had to go. If they refused to go, they would kill the families. And so he was gone, and my grandma was left alone to run the farm. My grandpa was able to come home some of the time, but that's kind of how it went for a couple of years. She talked about how he was able to come home one last time, and he wanted her to be with him so much that she went and stayed with him back at wherever that was for just a little while. But then she eventually had to come back to the farm, and that was the last she ever saw him. And within a few months of that, she was informed that he had been killed. And she said that she had a dream not long after that, I'm just going to read this so I get it right, but she said that she was walking with Herman, and she said she was wearing the boots that he bought her, and they were laughing and holding hands, and they were so happy, and they came to a gate on a bridge, and Herman walked through the gate, but she couldn't follow him, and she had to stay on the other side of the gate, and she never really understood why and was so sad about it. And later, after my grandmother passed away, so Herman's work in the temple was done, a long time ago. When her work was finally able to be done, my sister's daughter, Elisa, did her baptism, and Ashley was able to do her confirmation, and I did the initiatory, and my sister Cheryl did the endowment. And when I was doing the initiatory, I could feel her really strongly, and I never really said anything to the worker, but the worker turned to me and she said, "This sister is here with us. I can feel her." And I agreed with her, and I kind of explained, and I knew she was there, and I knew she was happy the work was done, and I was telling my mom about that when I came home, and I had called her, and then she told me about the story that I just said with the bridge, and she said now she can cross the bridge and the gate and be with her husband. So that was really touching to me. As I read about her life and learned more about the stories of her life, it's given me so much determination and purpose to push through when things are hard. And my life is not hard compared to these things. So anyway, that's my story.